Welcome, everybody. We are just beginning our webinar. We are waiting for more of our participants to log on. But in the meantime, we have a quick trivia question to get you thinking about the subject today. You'll see a poll on your screen. Feel free to select the answer you think is the right one. The question is, which countries hold the highest numbers in trafficking victims in this current year? We have 4 options, and we'll go over the correct one later in the program. So just give us a few minutes to allow some more people to log on, and then we'll get started.
Shilpa, you're muted.
I apologize. We are waiting a few minutes to start until more people can log on. We're expecting some more. We have a poll up on the screen to get you thinking about the subject. If you want to take a look at it, we'll go over the results later on in the discussion. Okay, so just as a reminder, if you want to log your poll, we're going to shut it down in a minute. But while we're waiting, I just wanted to go over a few preferred rules of conduct for the webinar today. If you can, please remain muted with your camera off. This will allow everyone to have an uninterrupted focus on the ambassador while she's speaking. And during the Q&A, once she's finished giving her remarks, if you could please put your questions in the chat, we will go through them and get the ambassador to give her opinion or point of view on them. Okay, last call for the poll. I'm going to shut it down. Thank you for those of you who participated, and we'll go over that later. Okay, so it is 12:06. So we're going to go ahead and get started today. My name is Shilpa Finnerty. I'm the Senior Fellow and Community Advisor for the UCF Center for the Study of Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery. Thank you all for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn. We're joined by Harriet Elam-Thomas, who is with UCF's diplomacy program and has a very interesting career in diplomacy that she's going to be sharing her perspectives on this very specific topic of human trafficking based on her worldview coming from a diplomat's perspective. So this should be a very interesting hour with her. Before we get into it, I want to introduce Tricia Connolly, who is with the Center's Advisory Council. She wants to say a few words about the center, and then I will introduce the ambassador. Thanks, Tricia.
Thank you, Shilpa. Yes, as Shilpa mentioned, we are the Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery Research Center at UCF. We're a small but mighty team, and we have a huge advisory board that helps us. We've been around for a handful of years now, about 3 years, started by my late mentor, John Bercia. He was a very passionate man at the fight of human trafficking and put this center together. It is the first of its kind in Florida, the third of its kind in the nation, the third of its kind in its nation. And so we are hoping even to inspire more people to have a research center like this and collaborate in our fight against human trafficking. So I'm quite excited. Ambassador Elam-Thomas is a great speaker, so you're all in for a treat. Thank you, Shilpa, and thank you, Ambassador.
Thanks so much, Trisha. So I'm very quickly going to introduce the ambassador. There's a lot that can be said about her, but I will read her bio and then I'll hand it over. So Ambassador Harriet Elam-Thomas directs a rapidly growing global initiative at the University of Central Florida, the Diplomacy program, which features education and training for undergraduate students. From 2003 to 2005, she served as diplomat in residence at UCF under the auspices of a national U.S. Department of State program. In that capacity, she was the U.S. Department of State's official liaison in Central Florida, conducting workshops, providing information on careers, connecting students to internship and scholarship opportunities, and speaking on policy matters. Until the fall of 2005, she was a senior foreign service officer with the rank of career minister. Previously, she served as U.S. Ambassador to Senegal from 1999 to 2003, Chief of Mission to Guinea-Bissau, Acting Director of USIA, Cultural Attaché at the American Embassy in Athens, Country Affairs Officer for Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus, Director of the American Press and Cultural Center, American Consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, and in other positions at the U.S. Mission to the United Nations, the President's Appointments Office at the White House, and the Foreign Service Personnel Office. Ambassador Elam-Thomas's additional posts were in France, Mali, and the Ivory Coast. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including the U.S. government's Superior Honor Award, the Lewis Roth Award for Excellence in Informational and Cultural Diplomacy, and a Group Superior and Meritorious Honor Award for her work in connection with the First Persian Gulf War. In 2007, she received the Director General's Cup of the U.S. Department of State. She holds a BS in International Business from Simmons College and an MA in Public Diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. She speaks Turkish, Greek, and French. Ambassador Elam-Thomas is partly sponsored by the Global Connections Foundation. So that's just a very quick introduction. This is an incredibly interesting woman that we're honored to have speaking with us today. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to the ambassador.
Thank you, Shilpa. And I'll ask if everyone can hear pretty well. If not, just raise your hand and I'll turn up the volume a bit.
You sound great to me, Ambassador.
Thank you, Tricia. And you would know you were the expert. I'm pleased to be here and yet not so pleased because we have a topic that is not one that everyone really can lift our spirits about. But that said, I think it is important for us to focus on it. And I will begin by telling you a story. You are 17, life is short and unpredictable as it has been. It's led you to a place where no 17-year-old should be. You are hungry on most nights and your house is no longer a home. Always alight with tension that never sleeps. Being alone with your thoughts is really a different kind of prison. One you avoid by lingering outside of school with other kids who laugh through puffs of smoke. But as the days go on, you begin to notice that even when you laugh with them, you are still alone. This is more devastating than any truth. at the house you live in. This is what leads you to a dark and desperate place. So imagine being offered a spot of light, a helping hand, a promise, a new family. Imagine that you follow that promising light out of a bad situation, hoping that it will lead somewhere better. Imagine receiving gifts, compliments, the bare minimum of respect and decency that you thought you never deserved. Imagine if you were a young woman in Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, the Sudan, and yes, the United States of America. Imagine how thankful you are with the promise of a more comfortable life where you are led to believe you will be happy and free. What I have just described is one of the many scenarios which is the focus of our discussion this afternoon. Human trafficking does not occur always with shady figures taking people in the middle of the night. It happens in schools, in social events, in suburban neighborhoods. It happens next door. At this very moment, this issue affects every country, every one of us, including the United States of America. So please keep these thoughts in mind as I describe my personal observations of this global scourge while I served abroad. Now, one might think that I could easily detect when something was amiss, or that we diplomats would be trained to notice certain patterns of behavior that are clear indicators of modern day slavery and human trafficking. I'm not proud to say that during most of my active career, the subject was not at the top of the list of US bilateral objectives. It was there, but it may not have been at the top. That lack of attention to trafficking is why I was sobered with what I saw in 2 of my 9 overseas assignments. I did not recognize what was right before my eyes. While one of the main responsibilities of US ambassadors is the safety and security of American citizens, we never forget the key to productive relationships is human rights. Now, human trafficking, thank goodness, is high on that list. And the moment we hear the term human trafficking, the first image that comes to mind, that enters our minds, is that of young women being trafficked for the sex trade. The media knows how to pull our strings, and they know how to pull our heartstrings. They know we'll be outraged. However, that is not the only kind of trafficking that exists. As modern citizens of the global community, we need to remind ourselves to think about our buying patterns. Think about what happens when we visit other countries. Our eyes are open, but do we really see? 2 tours of duty in Senegal, one as a junior diplomat and later as the ambassador, along with 4 years in Istanbul, Turkey, should have sensitized me and my colleagues to what transpired around us. Often our focus on democracy building and humanitarian assistance clouded our vision, because every day I saw children begging on the streets of Senegal. I naively thought this was a result of the abject poverty we witness in many developing countries, as we do right here in America. In Senegal, that term for the young boys is talibés, which means student or disciples. I was unaware that these young boys were forced to beg for their food by abusive teachers in Quranic schools. Their parents sent their sons, often far from their homes, to be educated at Islamic schools. However, many teachers in those schools abused the children under their care. They sent them out to beg and punished them harshly if they did not return with a certain amount of money or food each day. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations supports a global development initiative to end this Senegalese practice of child labor in Quranic schools. Now, the supervisors of these teachers are highly revered religious leaders called marabouts in Senegal. That is a country, as all of us are aware, is 95% Muslim, 5% Christian, and other religions. And in recent Senegalese elections, all of the presidential candidates and candidates for other offices have on their platforms that they are going to work to end the practice of forced labor and talibés. Now, although the ending was always high on the agenda of these presidential candidates, I'll be honest with you, I have seen little evidence of effectiveness. During a 2016 visit to Senegal with my husband, we witnessed the practice continued despite the government's efforts to crack down. And why does this practice continue? Many of the marabouts are revered religious leaders of the various brotherhoods in Senegal. And these leaders have large followings. They are extremely powerful and can determine the success or failure of candidates in Senegal. So I'm not overly optimistic given my recent conversations with friends who still live in Senegal. But how can we try to change some of the behaviors, these behaviors? We must become educated consumers, learn how the items we purchase are made and how our desires impact the life of the disenfranchised. Too often, we are preoccupied with our own personal priorities, and we seldom consider how interdependent we are. I'm as guilty as the next person. However, the pandemic has seized our attention and reminded us that transnational threats like the viruses have no boundaries. Human trafficking has no boundaries. They do not always distinguish between class nor status in a society. So reflect a bit on the negative global impacts such inhumane actions can have on the image and the economy and the political stability of countries around the world who failed to control or at least diminish the prevalence of human trafficking. And as I prepared these reflections, I was reminded that I own several Turkish carpets, Iznik tiles, materials and items, artwork from around the world, some of which were made by children in controlled environments. I'm not happy about that, and I do think I would have made better choices if I had been aware. Do we regularly consider that youngsters in many countries may have to work even though they cannot yet read? In war-torn nations, there are few remaining male figures in some families, so that several of the young boys become the breadwinners in a family. These young boys are so vulnerable to be influenced by terrorist organizations. I shudder to think of the futures of young Afghan women and men as we withdraw our troops. A few years ago, some of my colleagues will remember, and others in my class will remember, my talking about the highly publicized case where a foreign diplomat posted at the UN in New York abused one of her domestic employees. The Indian diplomat did not pay her nanny even minimum wage. The nanny was held against her will, and the Indian diplomat was charged, but did not pay a fine or back salary. But she, the consular officer, returned to India because of diplomatic immunity. The Embassy of the Philippines has been involved in similar practices, and I don't doubt there are others. A host of my former students and Global Perspective interns and fellows have lived and worked abroad. They've been in Vietnam, Cambodia, Colombia, China, Saudi Arabia, and parts of Latin America. They've told me of their surprise and some of the cultural practices they observed. Their experiences reminded me of a longtime friend named and human rights activist, Molly Melching, She's the founder of a very effective human rights non-governmental organization in Senegal. Molly visited UCF and Rollins College a few years ago, and I've known her since 1976. Molly gave us a vivid picture of the challenges when she ran a school for the Talibans in Senegal. One of her few disappointments, the school lasted only 2 years before it was clear that the Senegalese government was not truly committed to ending the practice of the marabouts mistreating these young Talibans. Sure, laws were written, but if not enforced, we all know they serve no value. I'm sure many of you know that the African continent itself is rich in minerals, and all of us rely on one of the prized minerals every time we pick up our cell phones, our smartphones. That mineral is coltan and is most prevalent in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It is used in the chips embedded in every smartphone. Children mine these minerals just as they mine gold in parts of Southern Africa. So it's going to be difficult to diminish the impact on the economic and social stability of these developing nations as long as modern day slavery continues to exist. So how do we stem the tide for such products that result from child labor? I just learned that there is a list that the Department of Labor produces and is available to the general public, which will tell us what products are the result of child labor. But there are the arts, the crafts, and souvenirs that we all want to own. But the pandemic has lessened the tourist trade, so perhaps this will be a positive outcome of the current lockdown. Ever the optimist, though, I am somewhat hopeful that there are ways that we can truly stem this tide. Take a look at the role of diversity in the diplomatic service. Would more female diplomats help? In my research, I learned that one woman human rights advocate was rejected for a critical position. Why? Because she was too concerned about the commoditization of females in sex trafficking. I would submit that a few more women lawyers and judges in the international legal arena would enhance attention to this global dilemma. The choice between dignity and enslavement lie in the balance. There is one absolute commonality among the victims of human trafficking and forced labor. It is the loss of personal freedom. If we think we have lost our freedom in the context of the current COVID lockdown in the United States and in the world, think again. Imagine this challenge if you were one of the victims of any of the cases I shared with you this afternoon. You were going to see momentarily in the visuals that come up on the screen that human trafficking is an industry that has devastated societies worldwide. Without eliminating it at home, our attempts to tackle this blight abroad is viewed, rightfully so, as hypocrisy. That 17-year-old I described at the beginning could be living right around the corner. She could be your classmate. He or she could be working for what we perceive as legal employers. But these victims are indebted to their employers for life in payment for their so-called freedom to reside in the United States. We must train ourselves to see the red flags that indicate human trafficking is taking place. I may have claimed ignorance in the earliest stages of my diplomatic career, but thanks to my presence at the University of Central Florida and my participation in the Human Trafficking Institute's programs, that ignorance no longer exists. So I will close with a quote which Steve McQueen made as he received one of his many awards for the 2014 Oscar-winning film 12 Years a Slave. Everyone deserves not just to survive, but to live. This is the important legacy of Solomon Northup. I dedicate this award to all the people who have endured slavery and the 21 million who still suffer slavery today. Every one of the persons on this Zoom webinar attending our Lunch and Learn session can help diminish modern day slavery. Through sessions like this one, we will sharpen our observation. We will be very careful about what we purchase, and we will acknowledge the humanity in everyone. So I thank you and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your thoughts and remarks on this topic. I did want to follow up with something you said, just to get us thinking while people process everything. Oh, I'm sorry. Before I get into this, let me just add, if you'd like to go ahead and type your questions in the chat, please do so. And we will get to your questions in a moment. Thank you. So I wanted to follow up on something you said about the role of embassies and the diplomatic community. And even you made a comment about if there were more women in the diplomatic community, would it be different? So what do you see as the role of the diplomatic community in helping to fight human trafficking? You gave some examples of a diplomat from India and an incident with the Filipinos, where that diplomatic immunity kind of came in and everything was swept away. So how do you balance that diplomacy and the real need for cooperation across between countries?
Well, thank heavens there is now the Human Rights Report that comes out every year, and the 2021 has just been published. In it, we, of course, track the countries that have reached various levels on this chart that we have of the adherence to diminishing human trafficking. But let's face it, the majority of the diplomatic service is still male, and we're working very diligently to change that, so that the reporting that comes from all embassies abroad is a process that comes from the political, economic, the diplomacy offices, the consular section. That input is what makes that report a valid one. But that input often is written by male colleagues who may not travel in the same circles as female diplomats might on their personal time, or making a specific effort to interact with other women in NGOs, in various positions in the cabinets in countries abroad. I know that I was particularly anxious to do so because I wanted to have their perspective in most of the countries where I had served, whether it was on the continent or whether it was in Greece or in Turkey. They were patriarchal societies, and I was anxious to hear what they had to say. So I do think that in today's world, we will see a change and an increased involvement of our female diplomats who will have an opportunity to craft and help change the way in which these reports are submitted.
Thanks. Yeah, something to look forward to as the diplomatic community continues to diversify, which I know is something that's really important to you.
But there is also another issue. Laws are different, and unless we have an agreement with each country, we may not be able to have the impact we wanted to have.
Okay. I see a few questions in the chat. Before we get to those, I wanted to reveal the results of our poll. So let's go ahead and do that. So I see we have a very smart audience, and everybody, for the most part, picked the correct answer. 50% picked India, China, Pakistan as the countries that hold the highest numbers in trafficking victims in the current year. So yes, they are historically known as hotspots, and they did continue to remain so in the current year. The next highest selection was Dominican Republic, Bolivia, and Mali, which is not a bad second option, I guess. That was our poll for today. Thank you for participating. Okay, we have a question from Trisha Connolly who wants to speak. And so I'm going to recognize Trisha, and then I will go to the chat following that.
Hey, Ambassador, thank you for that great talk. And so you hit me with a lot of lines, but one was you say, I would have made better choices if I was aware.
Yes.
And now with the list we have from the Department of Labor, we know where definitely we know child labor is being used. But what do you see as an individual's role in demanding transparency from corporations who may not be open with that information? Is that something of a cultural shift that has to happen as consumers in order for consumers to be better fighters? Like you said yourself, you would have made better choices if we were aware, but how do we become aware if that data is hard to get?
Well, I gather, even though I said I was not aware as much about the human trafficking when I was abroad, when I came home about 10 years before I retired from the diplomatic service, we were very much seized with the fact that clothing was made by certain designers in sweatshops. And you can be sure that very few women I know, no matter how much we like to be well-dressed, did not buy clothing that was made with those labels. And I remember clearly that the campaign was so effective that the companies had to stop. So I think if we had a similar outburst or campaign, and with social media today, it ought to be a lot easier to list those products that are hidden somewhere in the tomes of the Department of Labor. I am sure that if we made a concerted effort to publicize that in social media, even the most ardent fashionistas would think twice before they bought something. Now, in terms of tourism and people traveling abroad, should we ever get to do that, and I'm sure we will again, I think it's important for all of our travelers who read that State Department, we usually send out an advisory or a list or a country report on what to look for. And that should be stated in each one of our briefs before people travel abroad. We don't have the usual tourist agencies any longer. Everybody can make a reservation online. So we will be really behind the 8 ball because we don't have some institution that we can use to inform the general public who are going off on a cruise or on a tour about what are the sources of some of these products. So I do think that it's going to take quite a bit more work. It's going to take conversations like this one to sensitize and inform the public so that they will be far more careful in their choices. I know I will be.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That is a really great segue into our first question in the chat, actually. First question from Susan Vernon Devlin is regarding travel. And what can we do to recognize and report human trafficking? And to whom do we report it when we're overseas?
Well, that's not going to be very difficult. Every embassy will have a section in the American consular section where before you travel now, I would hope that all citizens register with the Department of State so that we know where you are, should there be a tsunami, an earthquake, or what have you. And as a personal example, I will never, ever forget how relieved my family was to find our relatives who were in Malaysia in 2004, when that took place. Why? Because they were registered, because we didn't know whether they were alive or dead. It would be helpful for all of our citizens who think about traveling think about it in a far more serious manner, more than just seeing the monuments and having fun and eating an elegant meal, but thinking about the culture and learning more about the culture before we get on a plane. And that can be done by having this material so easily available on websites. The minute the Bureau of Tourism, I'm sure, could set in place and a requirement for information on traveling to country XYZ on what to be observant of in terms of the possibility of human trafficking existing.
Shilpa, you're muted.
Sorry about that. She has a follow-up question asking to expand on what the Gates Foundation is doing to combat human trafficking around the globe. Are you aware of what the foundation is doing?
No, other than that one case with Senegal, because I had served there twice. But I would recommend research be done by the person who is curious as to what the current status is, because they have been involved in so many other things. I was not aware until I looked this up that their funds were being used for the stemming of human trafficking, specifically in Senegal. Abuse of children, I should say. Well,
this is actually, the next question is something I was curious about. So the question has to do with what can average Americans do to support the efforts to stop human trafficking? I had a similar thought, thinking about the average American citizen as more of a citizen of the world, a global citizen at this point, right? We've all seen how this pandemic has heightened just how connected we all are. So thinking about an American citizen as a global citizen even, what do you think the role of the average American citizen, the individual, is in fighting human trafficking?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we need to be more conscious and informed as consumers. We can certainly search for places or find out what these major big block, what do we call them, big stores, big lots, Walmarts and what have you, how they get their products. They are under such scrutiny these days that I dare say that they would not be able to continue to thrive if they were selling products that are a result of child labor. But we live right in Orlando, Florida, in a place called Apopka and Ocoee, are not very far from us, where there are orange groves, where there are fruit, where there are laborers who pick lettuce and the fruit and vegetables. If it weren't for the work of the Institute and the sisters that are in that city of hope, I don't know where we would be and where they would be. But that sensitized me, because I'm living in this part of the world now, to be very careful about where and how I purchase my fruits and vegetables. I think that there's still not enough publicity being given to that on the local news, and for people of my generation who don't live, eat, drink, and sleep on social media. And I do believe it would be helpful if there were heightened public service campaigns to remind people, just as we have months for various ethnicities and women and Pride Month, there ought to be a month that really focuses on how we can become more educated and sensitive to diminish human trafficking. It doesn't exist. I just thought of that.
There's a day. I think there's one day.
There is only one day.
Yeah.
Was there a second part of that question? I'm not sure.
No, I think you pretty much covered. We have another very specific question in the chat. I'm just going to read it verbatim. It says, in the 1990s, it was exposed that Saipan, which is part of the US Federation, had clothing sweatshops on the island. Following this came the exploitation of construction workers. What do you believe the US needs to do to ensure we lead the way to stop human trafficking?
To make sure that such things never happen again, and that every new Foreign Service officer, every person who is working on any US government related or funded program is made aware in his or her grant and his or her marching orders when they leave the country to be extremely observant and to report anything that looks to them suspicious. Because that's a travesty. And that was in what year in the question? When was that? When did that happen?
1990s.
In your work, have you seen this, Shilpa, at all in any of your course on human rights? You haven't seen anything on that
specific
issue?
Island sweatshop. I know that there have been cases where there are these remote locations.
Mhm.
This sounds familiar, that it's like technically the United States, but it's not under the same control that, say, it's a factory in Texas or Florida or someplace else would be under. So it's like it's almost
someone in Guam was there when this was
right, like Guam. Yeah, it's almost similar to the discussion we had about trafficking on the high seas. It's that it's out of sight, out of mind, and so it's harder to regulate further out there.
Seeing that the rest of this, I don't want to go, but I happen to see this. Labels that say made in America are suspicious to me. Because I know with the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, the Chinese would transship fruit and vegetables because they knew they could get into the United States without paying a tariff and put on it made in a country in West or East or West Africa. When in fact, if it wasn't a vegetable, it was products, it was materials and other things, so that they wouldn't have to pay. So I look very, very questionably at labels. I don't know if many Americans would know what to look for, and that takes for a very skilled person and an experienced person like the person who's lived and worked in Guam. We have a lot of military that work in places like that, and perhaps we could include them, the spouses, the way we have women and men who are now the spouses of diplomats who work in our community liaison offices, to be sure that they are aware of this and make sure that the Americans who are assigned there do not allow that such practices to proliferate.
Right. This is somewhat related to military. There's a question about addressing sexual exploitation and abuse taking place in country at the hands of UN stabilization missions or peacekeepers. For example, a few years ago, there was a report on sexual abuse and exploitation at the UN stabilization mission in Haiti. What are your thoughts on that?
And also happened in Pakistan. I was not pleased when I learned of that, and I don't know what the military has done since, but I also know there are not a lot of women who were in senior positions in the military to help them make a decision that such things would not happen. That was a good 10 or 15 years ago, if not longer. I remember shortly after the earthquake, or in another instance in Haiti, that was the case, and heaven knows it's probably even worse since their president has just been assassinated. But I do think it is beholden to all of us who are in the academic as well as in the diplomatic and in service organizations to keep that issue high on our list of priorities. But if the US military doesn't have enough women and others who are sensitive, the men somehow forget sometimes they have daughters and spouses. I think if they allow these things to happen. The UN peacekeeping force, though, is an international organization, and we have only one vote. So it's going to be hard for America to make a significant change alone. We have to remember we are dependent and interdependent. And that's something that sometimes we often forget.
Yeah, I do want to recognize someone who was based in Guam who wanted to comment on our discussion,
Please.
Made in America. Margaret, if you'd like to speak, please go ahead.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
So we were based in Guam when this story on the garment workers broke.
Mhm.
And as the Northern Marianas Islands are part of the Federation of US, they can put the US Made in the US label on there legally. And what they were doing was they were bringing people over from the Philippines and from China, and basically keeping them in enclosed areas. And it was really horrific. And there were major brand names, major brand names that had their clothing made there. So when this all broke out, there was some pushback. But once that closed down, the island had a problem with funding. And so they started to go to tourism, and Saipan brought on workers from China, construction workers, and then they started doing the same thing again to these construction workers. So all I'm saying is this is happening in our backyard, and it is because it's part of the federal islands of America.
Mhm.
It's happening right at home, but it's not here, so it's not seen very often because it's a small island.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Your
Thank you, Margaret.
observation, it illustrates why a discussion like this afternoon's is valuable, because I was certainly not aware and thought that, as you suspected, that those labels were not legally put on the clothing. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
I see another question related to lack of media coverage. So the question is asking, with the lack of media coverage on human trafficking by our mainstream platforms in the US and in other countries, how can the media and consumers resolve the issue? So I know you have commented on the need for more mainstream media, not just social media engagement.
I did, but I have to remember I'm looking at that from my generation's perspective. But the students that I taught at UCF certainly knew how to get a message across on social media. And every so often they'd tell me of something that I had said that they put in that said to me, well, that's good. I didn't even know where to find it. But we'll just have to learn to use that as a mechanism, because we're not going to be around forever, and the next generation certainly doesn't want to see a whole slew of women and men, boys and children being in forced labor in the 21st century.
Okay, we have a few more minutes. If anyone has a question, please type it into the chat. I'm going to use my moderator capability to ask a question that I thought of while you were talking about Senegal. It struck me when you talked about the Taliban that it is connected. On first glance, it looks like a cultural religious practice almost. So how do you separate that out as something that is not really based in religion? How do you educate the public or politicians and say, we're not infringing on religion. This is a violation of human rights. This is human trafficking. How do you navigate that?
Well, you just opened up another chance for me to talk about the importance of diversity. If I wouldn't be very effective in doing that, but if I had a colleague who practiced the Islamic faith were to interact with the host country officials, he or she would have a heck of a lot more credibility than Christian Harriet Elam-Thomas speaking to the top minister of education. So that if we had a service that was representative not of every one of the major religions on this God's earth, it would help because they would listen a lot more and be willing to interact and would be able to raise the issue without it looking as if here comes the 800-pound gorilla trying to tell us how to run our country. And that's a very delicate balance for diplomats. We have to be extremely careful not to assume that we act as if we know the answer to all of the world's problems, because we do not. So I do think that if we were to use, and I know now there are many men and women of different faiths who would be very effective in delivering that message.
Thank you. Oh, okay, I see a few more questions. One comment from our director, that state has been notoriously elitist in recruitment into the service. How do we overcome this bias?
Where have you been, Hugh, since May 25th, 2020, when someone was murdered in front of the world? We now have legislation that has gone to the Congress from the State Department to clearly indicate how we will have a service that not just gives lip service to diversity, but includes people with every different representation in the Department of State. That means we are changing the Foreign Service. We want to change the Foreign Service Act. So sadly, in many ways, I'm sorry that I'm coming to the end of my career, but more than 4 decades, close to more than 5 decades of working is long enough for the next generation to pick up the ball and run with it. But Hugh, you are absolutely right. But that, I believe, is changing. Now, the proof will be in the pudding, but I do see significant differences with the new director of diversity, the new head who is head of our the policy head, Wendy Sherman. I see the names of women, whether it's Gina Abercrombie, Winstanley, whether it's the new Director General, all of them will bring to the decision-making table a voice that has never been heard in the past. So the elitists that the department has been, and none of us will deny that, will diminish. And I do think we might be able to be far more effective around the world.
Thank you. I have one final question, and then we'll wrap up from Susan again. Thank you, Susan, for your questions. It asks, here in the US, we tend to see a rise in prostitution and underage vendors around large sporting events. Is it time to get the NBA, NFL, and MLB and others up to speed on initiatives to stop this human trafficking and exploitation surrounding these major events?
Sadly, all of us know that the World Cup, the NBA championship, before COVID, the Olympic Games, the Super Bowl, all of these were breeding grounds for increased evidences of human trafficking. I think that with more diverse leadership in the management and the ownership of these teams, not just the players, I do think that there will be an opportunity to hone in on the need to highlight and to monitor these individuals so that there will be fewer women and boys and men who will be trafficking victims. If we could put the NBA in Disney for 6 months and control what they did every single day during COVID this last season, we ought to be able to do the same in terms of human trafficking at these major sporting events. We've proven we can do that. We may not have had that example until COVID.
Yeah, actually, I'm reminded that UCF, one of our board members for the center, Richard Lapchick, he helps lead the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sports at UCF. And they have worked on this topic of trafficking and its ties to sporting events, as have a lot of the organizations in Orlando and in Tampa. We get a lot of big sporting events. So they are working on it. I think it's on their radar.
I'm sure. And if Richard Lapchick has anything to do with it, for those who don't know, just think of the name Bill Russell in sports, and his father is the reason why we know who Bill Russell is in the Celtics. So we're very fortunate to have someone like that still on this campus and doing what he's doing.
Yeah. So we're close to our hour here. It went very fast. Thank you everybody for your comments, and thank you to the ambassador again for her time and for sharing her thoughts on this topic and her career, really. I'm going to hand it back over to Tricia for some final words. But before that, I want to remind you that all of our webinars, we've had, I think about 7 at this point, are available on the Global Perspectives YouTube channel, which I just dropped in the chat. If you want to take a look at any of our previous webinars, there's quite a few on there now, and they've all been really fascinating. So Tricia, oh yes, go ahead.
I can never let it end without one final comment.
Yes,
and that is the importance of being humble and interacting with all of our interlocutors around the world on this subject and on any subject. Be willing to listen with empathy, and remember that we cannot live and function on this planet alone. So I thank you for having this, and I'm very pleased that I was able to take part in today's discussion, and I'm delighted that this institute exists here at UCF. Thank you, Tricia. Thank you, Shilpa.
Thank you. Go ahead, Tricia.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yes, we greatly appreciate your time. On behalf of the HCMS Center, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Hugh Potter, for your great direction with the center and initiating that we even start these Lunch and Learns. And I'd love everyone to join our newsletter, because we will have more Lunch and Learns coming up this fall semester. And hopefully we'll continue our trend of great speakers and great discussions. So thank you again for all your time today.
Thank you.